All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for attending today's webinar on key elements or on communication strategies before, during, and after cyber attacks. My name is Jake Swanson, and I'm a program coordinator at the U.S. Energy Association on the Energy Utility Partnership Program based in Washington, D.C. Please note this webinar is being recorded and all participants are muted with their video turned off. You're welcome and encouraged to post questions either in the chat or in the Q&A box below. I'll be monitoring them and passing them on to our presenters as appropriate. Just to give a brief background on USEA, we're a nonprofit membership association of public and private energy related organizations, corporations, and government agencies. USEA represents the broad interests of the U.S. energy sector by increasing the understanding of energy issues both domestically and internationally, through capacity building activities and events like this one. This series of webinars is financed through our cooperative agreement with USAID, the Energy Utility Partnership Program, and in particular through USAID's Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment, E3 Bureau. So this is actually our 15th and final webinar on our series on digitalization and cybersecurity. You can find recordings of past webinars on our website at usca.org/events and scroll down to the bottom. Now I will pass the floor over to Jamila Amadeo from USAID to give some brief opening remarks.
Thank you, Jake, and welcome to our 15th webinar on the topic of what to do and how to communicate before, during, and after cyber attacks. This is a critical element of restoring confidence in the time of crisis, and restoring confidence not only with the government leadership, but also with consumers. I'm Jamila Amadeo, Senior Energy Advisor with USAID's Global Energy Infrastructure Office. In this webinar, we'll continue and expand the discussion we started last week on trusted communication and information sharing with Frank Honkus of the Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center, ISAC, and Tom Wilson of Southern Company, a large regulated utility. Today, we'll hear a regulatory perspective and an unregulated utility perspective on communication strategies, including with the media, public, and consumers. We're honored to have Commissioner Rendell from the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. By the way, thank you, Commissioner Rendell, for joining us at 6:30 in the morning, presenting on the important role of energy regulators in strengthening the cybersecurity preparedness of critical infrastructure utilities, including the development of an understanding of utilities preparations and actions plans, convening energy sector entities and state and federal cybersecurity partners to understand roles and responsibilities in advance of an attack, and developing a crisis communication strategy focused on cybersecurity incidents. Also, we'll hear how the regulators use those strategies to communicate with and to respond to government leaders, other agencies, utilities, media. I would like to take a moment here and thank Commissioner Rendell for her dedication to supporting USAID cybersecurity programs through our partnership with the National Association of Regulatory Utilities Commissioner, NARUC. She was among the first US commissioners to join the Black Sea Regulatory Working Group, where she introduced the importance of regulatory cybersecurity strategy, the development of it, the role of trusted communication between regulators and utilities, and the art of asking questions to build regulators' confidence and utilities' preparedness. We are happy to welcome also Carter Manussi, IT and OT and Cybersecurity Director from the Florida Municipal Power Agency, to learn how his member utilities communicate with each other and other utilities in the case of cyber attacks. On behalf of USAID, I would like to thank both of our presenters and also all of our attendees for joining us today. Based on the feedback we received from webinar attendees throughout the 14 webinars, we received very good positive feedback. This first global webinar series turned out to be a great success. Thanks to all our volunteer experts like Commissioner Rendell and Carter Manussi who shared their knowledge and expertise with us. And thank you all who joined us from 68 countries. We're pleased that over 1,000 participants attended, much more registered. Our webinars, and among those attendees, had government officials, regulators, researchers, manufacturers, vendors, and over 70 utility representatives. Together with my colleague Kristen Madler and our USAID partners, we're happy to let you know that following this webinar series of as the next phase, we will start Business Innovation Partnership Initiative, where USAID and USCA will support select utility champions. Many of those who attended our webinar series to integrate innovative technologies to better meet increasing customer expectations, to effectively adapt to new regulatory frameworks, adopt new business models, and to implement business processes and procedures, including those that are designed to help utilities to be better manage and to better manage their cyber risks. In response to participants' requests, we'll be hosting 2 industry panels that Jake will be addressing. Please mark your calendars to join our discussions with leading US cybersecurity firms on the latest trends and tools in cybersecurity. Both panels will be moderated by Andy Bachman from the Idaho National Laboratory. Once again, I would like to thank all of you joining us today. As always, we value all your questions and your feedback. Stay safe and healthy. And with that, I'll pass the microphone to Jake. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. And as Jamila just mentioned, we have 2 industry cybersecurity panels that we're very excited about. The first one is on November 18th on energy sector cyber threats, intrusion detection and testing. And the second one is on December 2nd on cyber risk management through measurement. So be sure to keep an eye on your emails for an invitation to that industry panel. Again, today's webinar is on communication strategies before, during, and after cyber attacks. Our presenters will address a variety of communication strategies and practices that energy regulators and utilities, regulated and not regulated, can adopt to prepare for and respond to a cyber attack. Today, we have the pleasure of having Commissioner Ann Rendall from the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. Aside from being a commissioner, Ann is active in several national and regional organizations focused on energy policy, including as chair of the Electricity Committee of NARUC, a member of the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI's Advisory Council, a member of the body of state regulators for the Western Energy Imbalance Market, and as chair of the Western Renewable Energy Generation Information System Committee. Also joining us today is Carter Manussi, IT, OT, and Cybersecurity Director at the Florida Municipal Power Agency, FMPA. At FMPA, he has responsibility over all corporate information technology, as well as the operational technology as it relates to FMPA's generation assets. With more than 25 years of experience, Carter has held numerous roles in the IT/OT domain while maintaining a passion for cybersecurity. Carter often advises for the interests of the American Public Power Association and other municipal trade associations regarding cybersecurity policy and NERC-CIP compliance. Carter is currently the chair for the Cyber Mutual Assistance Compliance Committee and was a voting member for NERC-CIP. So we're very pleased to have you both here. And with that, I will pass the floor over to Ann.
Good day, everyone. I'm going to share my screen now and start my slides. Okay, Jake, is that working?
Perfect.
Okay. Now I need to figure out how to. Okay, can you turn off my camera? I'm not sure I can do it from.
Yeah,
Here we go. I got it.
Okay.
I got it. Okay, is that working? All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Good day. I know we're at different time zones. I'm honored to share with you some communication strategies that my agency, the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission, or UTC, has used to address the potential for cybersecurity attacks or incidents involving the utilities that we regulate. So before we begin, I'd like to make clear that my comments today are my own and not those of the Commission, my fellow commissioners, or the staff. The Washington UTC protects the people of Washington by ensuring investor-owned utility and transportation services are safe, available, reliable, and fairly priced. While our focus here this morning is on the reliability of energy systems, my agency regulates a wide range of services provided by investor-owned companies, including electric and natural gas distribution companies, landline telecommunications companies, solid waste collection companies, water systems, natural gas and hazardous liquid pipelines, railroad carriers, residential movers, commercial ferries, passenger buses, low-level nuclear waste storage, and marine pilotage. So we cover quite a number of different industries. As far as the electric industry, there are 63 electric companies in Washington state, but the UTC regulates only 3 of these, the investor-owned utilities. The other 60 electric utilities in the state are publicly owned entities, municipal utilities like Carter Minucci's agency, public utility districts, rural electric cooperatives, and tribal utilities, and we have no regulatory jurisdiction over these utilities. So with that background, let's turn to the focus of today's discussion. So today I'm going to highlight 4 communication strategies you can use before, during, and after a cybersecurity event. While the UTC has not experienced a cybersecurity event involving its regulated utilities, we have developed these strategies so that we can be prepared. Following the Great Recession of 2008-2009, the UTC received funding from the Federal Department of Energy under a grant program, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. One of those focus areas of the grant was to increase our staffing and efforts related to cybersecurity. When we received the grant funding in 2010, I was the UTC's policy director. I was asked to lead the agency's efforts to develop a cybersecurity plan and to hire additional staff to focus on cybersecurity. During this time, Washington State Commissioner Philip Jones became NARUC's president and made cybersecurity the focus of his presidency. During that time, NARUC was developing several key resources to help state commissions. So through this effort, the UTC identified several strategies, including those related to communication. And these strategies include developing a work plan, communicating with utilities, communicating with other organizations to create partnerships related to cybersecurity, and developing a crisis cybersecurity communications plan. So now I'll go through each of these strategies in greater detail. As you develop a strategy in your organization for addressing cybersecurity, you'll need to include one for communicating about cybersecurity, both within your organization and externally with utilities, other organizations, the government, and the consumers. This communication strategy should be an integral part of your cybersecurity plan. At the UTC, we first created a charter for a cybersecurity team, identifying the mission, our team members, and our proposed actions, and then we obtained approval from our senior management team. We created a team that included staff across the agency, those that advised commissioners who worked directly with the utilities on their rate filings, as well as key communications personnel and staff in our information services section. Next, we developed a work plan to map out our efforts, including staff training, outreach to the utilities, outreach to other key organizations, and developing a crisis communication plan. We identified a need for training to ensure that the staff team had sufficient resources through online and in-person training on cybersecurity basics, understanding that we would never be the technical cyber experts, but that we would need to understand the basics of cybersecurity and reliability requirements that utilities face, as well as cyber frameworks to work with utilities and other organizations on cybersecurity best practices and planning. A critical part of our work plan was the outreach to utilities that the UTC regulates to begin a conversation. We needed to start this constructive conversation with key utility staff so that they would know that the agency was aware of the cybersecurity risk to utilities, that we wanted to begin an ongoing conversation about how each utility was approaching its prevention and potential response and recovery efforts. And we wanted to know how each utility was working with other utilities and government organizations about this threat. As we could not meet with all the utilities and the regulated entities at once, we developed a sequenced set of meetings to initiate the conversation, beginning with the electric utilities, then the natural gas distribution companies, then water companies, and then telecommunication companies subject to our regulation. Finally, we worked with our communications director to develop a crisis communications plan for a cyber event. I'll discuss this later in more detail. Having this work plan, which we adjusted as we went along, helped guide the efforts of the cybersecurity team. It provided a means to check in with leadership and ensure their support, and to provide a structure for figuring out our short and our longer term goals. So in executing that part of our work plan for communicating with the utilities that we regulate, we began by reviewing and considering the primer on cybersecurity that the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, first prepared in 2012 through Department of Energy funding. The primer has been updated several times to reflect changing standards and maturity models for preparing for a cybersecurity event, which I know you've heard about in prior sessions. Through a collaborative effort and funding by the Department of Energy, NARUC has further updated and expanded the primer to a cybersecurity manual to help guide state utility commissions in responding to the cyber threat. And in addition, over the past few years, NARUC, with the support of USAID under the Energy and Infrastructure Division of the Bureau for Europe and Eurasia, has produced a number of publications to support international energy sector resilience as part of the USAID Europe and Eurasia Cybersecurity Initiative. One of the critical elements of the NARUC primer and manual is a set of over 100 potential questions that state regulators can ask their regulated utilities. The UTC relied on these questions, modifying them to fit our situation in developing our initial efforts to communicate with our utilities. But we didn't pose all the questions to the utilities. The primer includes questions focused on a large number of topics, such as the utility's planning efforts, the standards the utility must comply with, the utility's procurement and risk management practices, how the utility staff are trained and involved in cybersecurity, the utility's internal governance on this issue, their response and recovery plans, the separation of systems and operations, and other topics. The UTC cyber team scheduled several initial meetings with our utilities to discuss their cybersecurity prevention and response efforts. We reached out initially to our regulatory contacts at the utilities, explaining our proposal, our request, and suggested meeting in person at the utilities' offices. Needless to say, some of the utilities were concerned about their confidential information. We were making clear that we would maintain that confidentiality and secure information in our communications with them, and that we wouldn't be asking for any documents to bring back to the commission or for them to send us any documents. While we understood that we had the statutory authority under our state law to ask for certain documents, and that we had protections under our Public Records Act to protect them from disclosure if somebody asked for them, we were not sure that having those documents in the agency and potentially on our electronic systems was the most secure way to go about this. So we didn't want to risk disclosure through any hack of our commission systems. So for that reason, we met in person. We sent the questions to the utilities in advance. We asked to review some documents in person there in our meetings, but we did not take anything back with us or have them send anything to the commission. So in those meetings, we would, because we sent the questions to the utilities in advance, they would walk through their responses to the questions. We could delve a little further. Now, we didn't get into any secure information. None of the folks on the UTC's, none of the staff on the UTC's team had a clearance, and so we couldn't talk about anything that was classified, but we talked in very general terms. And we've continued this process every year or in between to ensure that we continue to understand the utilities' efforts. Over time, it's become easier for both staff and utilities to discuss cybersecurity threats and concerns, because over time we've developed a trusted relationship. Our staff are gaining knowledge, and their staff are becoming more comfortable with the information that they're sharing with the commission. Through these meetings, we've learned who the critical cybersecurity contacts are at each utility, and we work to maintain those contacts so we know who to reach out to if we have questions or if an event occurs. Through NARUC's primer and manual and other educational resources, and in working with utilities, we've learned more about the various standards and maturity models so that we could discuss how the utilities are using those various tools. And when we meet with the utilities now, they share their maturity model results and discuss any changes from the prior year, as well as any additional actions they're taking. These meetings help identify issues and concerns that are non-classified, of course, and how those issues and concerns change over time with the changing cyber threat. So overall, after the initial meetings about what the commission was planning to do and ensuring that we would protect the utilities' confidential information, it's turned into a good conversation. Initiating and continuing our communication with the utilities on cybersecurity issues helps prepare the commission staff and the utility to quickly know who to talk to and identify issues in the event of an incident. The next communication strategy you can implement is to communicate with and develop working relationships with key partners. The NARUC primer includes questions related to partnerships or alliances the utility has developed, and across public and private sectors for information sharing, planning, and situational awareness around cybersecurity. Just as it is essential for utilities to develop these partnerships, it's also important for regulators to foster these relationships. In fact, given the authority and the role of the regulator, you have the ability to convene a wide group of participants to create awareness about cybersecurity, even if you don't regulate them. You can develop relationships and create an understanding of the roles and responsibilities each organization faces when responding to incidents. So our UTC cyber team set up workshops with both regulated utilities and publicly owned utilities that we don't regulate, with a number of three-letter federal security agencies, such as the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and also a number of state agencies, including our Emergency Management Division, the State Cybersecurity Information Office, our State National Guard, our national laboratories, state universities, and key businesses to discuss efforts each organization was taking to address cybersecurity and how to work better together. Overall, cybersecurity is a shared responsibility, so it helps to know who's involved in the preparation, response, and recovery for any incident, so you better understand how you can participate. So as a result of this coordination and discussion, the UTC helped contribute to creating a community in Washington State focused on cyber preparedness. There have been regular meetings and conferences to discuss cybersecurity preparedness. So for a few examples, we held a conference specific to water utilities given the critical nature of water infrastructure and that there are many small water companies in Washington who may not be aware of key actions they can take to protect their systems and customers. In addition, after one of our public utility districts engaged a team from the National Guard to conduct penetration testing on their system, the utility held meetings to share the results and several key actions utilities can take to avoid and reduce such an attack. Our staff regularly participate in state and federal tabletop exercises, including GridX. Joining in such exercises helps your organization and those in other organizations to understand your role and the role of others in a crisis, minimizing assumptions about actions your organization has the authority to take to best prepare for effective coordination in a real crisis. In addition, it's necessary to maintain your regular communications with your critical partners as people change roles and jobs and threats continue to change over time. So keep your contacts current. It's another reason to keep meeting with your cyber partners to make sure you know who to contact when an event occurs. Finally, the fourth key communication strategy you can adopt is to develop a cyber crisis communications plan. There's a saying in the transportation planning sector. My husband is a transportation planner and frequently mentions this to the family. Prior planning prevents poor performance. In fact, we've seen this in action in 2020. Those organizations that had pandemic plans in place were in a better position at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic to respond. Organizations often have a crisis communications plan in place to be ready to quickly address any number of crises. Similarly, developing and testing and exercising a cyber communications plan prior to a cyber event will help your agency or organization in its response. This is not a crisis management plan, but a communications plan, and it's focused on answering the following key questions. Who needs to know? Who will be looking to you for answers? And who do you need to contact to find out what's going on? As the regulator, the governor, the media, or at least in Washington, the media and the governor and others are going to be looking to me and my colleagues for answers if a utility we regulate is impacted by a cybersecurity attack. So we'll need to identify those organizations, the key staff in those organizations that we'll need to get information from and provide answers to. So we're going to have to quickly provide information directly to the governor's communication director, other executive agencies, media contacts, and our own agency management staff. And we might need to get information about the nature of the threat, the extent and the impact of the attack, and any response efforts from our utilities, in particular those affected by the event, and if there's any federal and state agencies involved, those agencies. As I mentioned previously concerning key partnerships, it's important to maintain a current list of contacts at utilities, federal and state agencies, and the governor's office so that you have the right names and contact information if an event happens. As with any crisis during a cyber event, you're going to need to identify your leader, the person who's coordinating this response. The communication response, similar to the incident command structure, you need to know who's leading the communications effort, and you're going to need to identify whether you have an internal subject matter lead on cybersecurity, who's the lead in communicating with persons outside the agency, and who's leading the communication internally and communicating an action plan. So it's best to prioritize which contacts you're going to reach out to first, and in working with your partner organizations, practice your cyber crisis communications plan so you know how to snap into action if anything goes awry. And as with other crisis planning efforts, it's important to maintain communication with your contacts and ensure continuous improvement so that your plan is not just a one and done, check the box effort, but something that you continuously review to make sure it remains relevant and useful in the event of an attack. So I've shared 4 communication strategies for addressing the risk of a cyber event: making a detailed work plan that will guide your efforts and allow you to share your work and receive support from the leadership of your organization, communicating with utilities to develop key contacts and to better understand the actions the utility is taking to prevent, respond, prepare for, and recover from a cyber event, communicating with external partners to develop a community of cyber awareness and understand roles and responsibilities, and developing a cyber communications plan. exercising it so that you know who the agency's subject matter expert will be, who you'll be communicating with in the governor's office, utilities, and the media, and who your key contacts will be in those organizations. So thank you for the opportunity to share these communication strategies from the Washington State regulatory perspective, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you to my colleague, Johanna Colemans-Bainen, who's posted several of the resources that you mentioned in the chat box below. I would like to note that one of the reports that you mentioned, one of the authors of that report was Miles Keogh, who was actually a speaker in our first webinar. So it's kind of interesting that we came full circle from webinar 1 to all the way to 15. So thank you so much for that, Anne. And with that, I will pass the floor over to Carter.
Thank you. All right. So thanks everybody for participating from whatever time zone you're in. I wanted to kind of pivot on some of the things that Anne talked about here, and further dive into some details on some of these strategies. A little bit about me. I've been working at FMPA for well over 24 years now, overseeing both the industrial control systems, OT environments, as well as the corporate IT stuff. But I've been a member of a various number of committees over the years, contributed with NERC, subject matter expert for a lot of power, public power initiatives and other transmission dependent utilities, and have been very involved with a lot of different standard development, and just trying to figure out the best way to handle cybersecurity, which is a very complex issue with the electric industry. A little bit about FMPA. FMPA's members are 31 municipal cities in Florida. They're also our owners. So FMPA is owned and governed by the members that we serve. FMPA owns generation as well as provides power through power contracts and cooperative agreements. But we also provide professional services to its members, or to our members, and we're a very active participant in national efforts around policy and compliance. And just for clarity, FMPA does not have traditional customers. Our members are the ones that would have those end customers. So we're more of a wholesaler, if you think of it that way, than a normal utility. But it is vitally important that within any process that you have, that you keep your clear lines of communication going, so that any customers that may be impacted by events are clearly informed, and that line of communication has happened. So that's something that I wanted to pivot off of from the previous conversation. A little overview of what we're going to talk about here. I want to follow up on some of the points previously made, but on communication strategies. And there's a lot of partnerships that you have to utilize in order to be successful and accomplish the goal of providing low-cost power like FMPA does, because cybersecurity can have a huge impact on that bottom line if it's either done improperly or if you have an event. So some of these partnerships with other government agencies become more peer focused. To that end, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the environment of what an event looks like. We'll pivot to talk about how we can build your circles of trust, being prepared for those types of events, talk a little bit about exercising, and then finally I'll wrap it up with what it might look like to get back to normal after an event happens. The first thing we have to talk about and understand when you think about a life cycle of an event is, if you've ever reviewed major frameworks for disaster recovery, such as the National Preparedness Goal, it's presented by the Department of Homeland Security here in the US, and they will often break down these events into basic categories. So there's a common lexicon for discussing each of these phases of an event. In this model, we have prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. So each of these areas are distinct events that happen, and they are defined by their own characteristics. While the National Preparedness Goal is really about a much broader topic, I'm focused specifically on the electric sector for our conversation here. In our area, the prevention is mostly akin to items like information sharing and detection actions. This is where getting information from organizations that have seen activity happen within your sector that can come to your aid. For example, if I'm told that a certain threat actor is using a specific phishing campaign against other entities in the electric sector, I can be on alert. I can notify staff, preemptively block known indicators of such activities. For protection, this is really all about cybersecurity, right? So this is keeping things patched, installing firewalls, having antivirus software installed. These are the types of actions that we take in order to protect the assets that we need to keep safe. And when we talk about mitigation, it's about how to minimize the impact of a risk, an event, or a disaster. Mitigation also requires a cooperation of a community of people, organizations, or governments that can come together to help reduce the risk by helping plan for an entire community's resilience. We perform these exercises to focus around the mitigation and the lessons learned, so we can then identify the scenarios that would stretch our ability to respond and thereby identifying opportunities for improvement. I'll touch a little bit more on that in a minute. Response is what we do after the event has happened. This is where all your training comes into play, right? This is game day. As part of the critical infrastructure, it is up to us to reestablish service within the affected areas to support ongoing emergency responses to an event. And the recovery aspect is just that. What do you do next? What needs to be repaired, replaced, hardened before it can come back online safely? When we live our lives in this environment, we always hope that we spend all of it in the first three areas, right? In between mitigation and response is that event. Some of us refer to that as boom. So likewise, we like to say that the stuff left of boom is and right of boom are distinct areas of where we concentrate our efforts. So on the left of boom side, this is where you're in a constant state of improvement. When the event happens, all bets are off. Your incident response plan and your disaster recovery plans come into effect on that right of boom section. So we like to spend, we would love to be able to spend our entire lifetime, right? If that were possible, left of boom. We don't want the event to happen, but this is where we train. This is where we do regular exercises. This is where we improve our processes and refine what we do in our communication. So by continually improving and exercising, you're going to have a much higher chance of success when it comes to an actual cyber event. So talking about what you do beyond understanding the environment, let's focus a little bit on circles of trust here. For many areas of critical infrastructure, just standing up one particular item it's just not enough. Maybe you're a small entity that's dependent on a larger one to come online before you can serve your customers. Either way, we don't act in silos in the energy sector. This means that we have to work together. And when it comes to cybersecurity and cyber events, if you focus just on what you know as an individual or as an individual utility, based on your own information, you're probably going to have an incomplete picture of what's going on at a broader level. To that end, we rely on information sharing and analysis centers, or ISACs, which is what the previous presentation was concerning. So, they help us share information, right? These ISACs each focus on different specific areas of the critical infrastructure, and each one has a different specific criteria to become a member. For example, we have the EISAC, that is the electricity ISAC. The ISAC reduces cyber and physical security risks to the electric industry across North America by providing unique insights, leadership, and collaboration. And in order to join the EISAC, you have to be a vetted electricity owner and operator in North America. We also have the MSISAC. That's one that we are also a member of. That's the multi-state ISAC. And their mission is to improve the overall cybersecurity posture for the nation's state, local, tribal, territorial governments through focused cyber prevention, protection, response, and recovery. Those words should sound familiar. You have to be one of these governmental entities in order to become a member. But once you are, you'll have access to a tremendous amount of cybersecurity resources. We also have other sector-specific ISACs, such as the DNG, which is a downstream natural gas ISAC, ONG, oil and natural gas, water ISAC. So you see that they're very sector-specific based off of the customers that they serve or the industry that they are part and representative of. If you are in any of these industries or you have these and you have the ability to join them, I certainly encourage you to do so. We also have other resource groups that are available to utilities. For example, FMPA is a joint action agency. So if you are a municipal electric utility, I would recommend that you get involved with your joint action agency in your area for help. For cooperatives, we have similar organizations. We have trade organizations that help the different utilities, such as APPA for the American Public Power Association. We have the NRECA, which is the National Regional Electric Cooperative Association for our cooperative folks, and EEI, which is the Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade organization for investor-owned utilities. There's also an international effort known as Cyber Mutual Assistance, or CMA. CMA is more than it's more of a program than an organization, and it's comprised of utilities that represent over 80% of the electric meter customers in the U.S. and Canada. And I'll cover a little bit more about CMA shortly, because it's a great thing to mimic if you don't have in your own environment or your area. You can also get involved with local regional cybersecurity groups. For example, in North America, we have NERC. That's the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. NERC is divided up into 7 geographical regions, and within each of these regional groups are various working groups and committees that focus on the individual responsibilities for compliance and cybersecurity of their individual utilities. The discussions that we have in these groups encourages a collaboration, and you get to know your neighbors, and it helps with information sharing. It's a great way to get to know your fellow utilities. Of course, there are also federal agencies as well, local law enforcement, FBI, DHS for us in the US. Each of these groups can help you in different ways, be it participating in events, information sharing, performing assessments, taking action with boots on the ground support if that's what's needed for your particular incident. For the US-based utilities, we also have the National Guard, and they have capabilities that can come in and help us as well. But we should always work on trust amongst your own customers, right? You have to have a good communication plan and strategy in order to keep them informed of what's going on in an event, and be it a standard outage due to a squirrel or something more insidious like a cybersecurity event. Now, when it comes to asking for help, there are a few steps you need to take. The first area I wanted to cover was a little bit more about mutual assistance. For years, the electric power industry in the US has been preparing for cyber threats. We've developed a number of different prevention and mitigation programs that are protecting the electric power grid every day. The sector is confident that in a lot of these programs, and the industry recognizes that we can't protect all assets from all threats all the time. We also realized early on that, if an event happens, some of the folks that we might rely on normally may be too preoccupied to help us in our particular event if something was so widespread. And that's why we developed the Cyber Mutual Assistance, or CMA program. And that's to help electric companies restore critical computer systems following some significant cyber events. Mutual assistance has defined our industry and how we respond to incidents over the last several decades. It allows companies affected by significant outages following like hurricanes and other major disasters to expand their restoration efforts by utilizing crews and equipment from other companies. It's been the hallmark of the electric power industry for decades, and we've been very successful at restoring service following these types of events: wildfires, earthquakes, hurricanes. And during this, or using the same mutual assistance concept as a model, CMA program was launched in 2016. That program was created by a pool of industry experts who can provide voluntary assistance in the event of a disruption, a threat, or a natural gas issue due to cyber emergency. And that assistance provided by these experts is intended to be advisory in nature and on a short-term basis. We're not here to create a incident response program or plan or a whole program for that type of a thing, but we're certainly there for assisting and augmenting an existing program or staff. So, the assistance can be remote, depending on the scenario. With COVID-19, we certainly don't do as much travel or on-site stuff, but, it's not just a cyber emergency as well. We can also be used in a proactive basis for discussing cyber threats throughout the industry. So that gets back into the communication component I talked about before and information sharing. As far as participation in the program, it's completely voluntary. There's no cost, and all you really have to do is sign a mutual non-disclosure act and an agreement as far as how cost sharing would go. Once those two documents are executed, then the utility is in the program, and those resources become available to you. So the CMA utility will also designate a coordinator who will serve as that primary contact for the program, and that coordinator has to be a senior level expert with the authority to act on behalf of the utility that they're representing. But once you have a program that you can activate, you have to know when you should ask for help. And honestly, this answer is going to depend on your internal preparedness and bandwidth. The more time you spend getting to know your peers, other trade organizations, the more successful you're going to be in getting help when needed. And this is true about every type of an exercise. The more you practice, the better off you're going to be. And as we talked already, exercising the plans is the only way to really know how everyone is going to work together in a real event. So when it comes to preparing your utility for a cybersecurity event, the very first question to ask is, do we have a plan? If you don't have an incident response plan and a disaster recovery plan, which, by the way, are two very different things, you should spend some time putting those together. While I don't have the time to go into detail about what would constitute an incident response plan, at the very least, you should have a team of folks that are ready to work together, a communication process for informing both leadership and other stakeholders as to what's going on, what's needed, and what to do next. The next question you should ask is, if you have a plan, have you actually exercised it? If all you do is put together this plan and set it on the shelf, it might as well not even exist. No one is going to have the time during an event to do a page turn through a manual and find old phone numbers of people that no longer work at organizations. These types of things just don't work. So you really got to understand who it is that you're going to be calling. And oh, by the way, do those people know that you're planning on calling on them? If you have a phone number for your local law enforcement or the FBI or something like that, and the field office has never had a communication with you, that conversation is not going to go too well in the event of emergency. So make sure that you plan through these things and you organize in exercises and have these communication systems available to you. And think about alternate communication methods. Do you have any other way of communicating other than just the phone? If you have some kind of event that's actually affecting your phone system, how is it you're going to use that same phone system in order to communicate with the people that you need to get help from? So think about that. What's next? Keep drilling into those conversations to make sure you understand how far you need to go with your communications. And you should always have alternate phone numbers or other ways of communicating with key stakeholders. Don't rely on just one way of doing it, because that's really important for being successful in these events. And last but not least, exercising. If you don't practice, you will not succeed. There are a number of different organizational exercises that we do. We have the NERC GridX exercise, which is a national level exercise. Had over 6,500 participants back in 2019. And that took a huge amount of coordination in order to happen. CMA does exercises. We have regional exercises. There was another exercise put on by DARPA. And DARPA is actually part of the radix exercise, which is just a rapid detection, isolation, and characteristic systems. Really goes into gory detail of what happens during an event, how to recover, how to keep critical load online, stuff like that. So these types of events and exercises really get you where you need to be, so you can understand if your plan is actually adequate or if you need to make adjustments and changes over time as the environment changes. And then what happens after an event? What does it look like when you come back to normal? Is it the same as what it was? Are your relationships the same? Are the expectations the same? Does something happen to your organization? Either by being affected by ransomware or some other thing that made you change your relationships with your insurers or different regulators or your communication methods. So take advantage of these exercises and lessons learned to make improvements. In the world of cybersecurity, things change so very rapidly. And if your organization is static, you're going to be left behind, and you may be left at an unrecoverable point at that from there. And last but not least, make sure you keep that conversation going. Be the catalyst for your area. Bring people back to the table for discussions around exercises. Create your own mutual assistance program in your area. Help each other out. Learn from your mistakes. Share information with your ISACs. But whatever you do, don't stop learning and sharing. And with that, I think that's all I've got, and I think we can perhaps have time for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Carter. And I think you had a lot of really great takeaways that are applicable to, you know, a lot of different aspects of cybersecurity. It's like you want to make your plan, you want to exercise it, you know, and constantly revisit it, because as you said, you know, the cybersecurity industry is constantly changing. So thank you both for those great presentations. I'll transition now for a couple of questions. So I'll start off with this one. In situations when the full impact of an attack is not known, what should be communicated with the media and with consumers, and kind of what level of detail should utilities and regulators communicate?
And do you want to take that one?
I was going to say, why don't you start first in terms of what you communicate as a utility about what's going on?
So this one's really interesting because, you know, these events are very fluid in nature. When you have a cyber event, the indicators and what's actually going on are key drivers for how you communicate. We've had events in the past where utilities have actually acted on information that they had received. The information was not accurate, or it needed a little bit more refining before before you should have acted on it. They put out a notice to a regulator, and then that got out to some news organizations, and then it ends up being a black eye for everybody because it just shows a breakdown in the communication. So you have to really exercise your communication plans and understand, hey, if this is what's going on, this is how we're going to communicate, and this is what we're going to tell everyone. Once you get to that point of understanding and comprehension that yes, things are bad and things are down, or there's definitive answers, you need to get that information out as soon as possible through all communication paths. It's not just the regulators, but it's also your ISACs and your neighbors and sharing programs and everything.
Right, and I will say, as a regulator, I would really only know what is going on if there's some customer affecting issue. Then obviously then there's an issue that the utilities are responding to, that they are then communicating to us, and we have particular requirements on how quickly they need to respond to us in terms of customer outage. Now, if it was customer billing information that wasn't apparent to the customers at the time, then there's state statutes on how quickly organizations have to reveal that. It's not just the regulatory agency, it's our Attorney General's office, and there's some other requirements there. Depending on the extent of the issue, again, as Carter said, there could be other entities involved. This could be broadly spread across a number of utilities, in which case you might have the FBI, you might have Department of Homeland Security, you might have others involved in trying to figure out what's going on and to respond. Some of our utilities have hired, they have on retainer cybersecurity experts who they can call on in the event of an issue that they can't resolve themselves. So we're going to rely on what the utilities are telling us first. If there's a customer facing issue, then we're going to snap into action more quickly, and questions are going to be coming directly from the governor's office and from others if it's clear that it's a cyber issue. If it's not clear that it's a cyber issue, then whether it's just a regular outage or whether it's a cyber issue is not something you're going to know right away until you get that information. And it could be classified. It could be something that you don't want to release to the public right away. Or it could be you do need to let the customers know right away if it's going to spill over into their system. So there's a lot of different ways this can proceed, and I think which is why Carter was explaining the criticality of your cyber mutual assistance and the criticality of testing and exercising these, so you know what different avenues these things can take. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of going off that, you mentioned that smaller utilities might hire, third parties to kind of help with messaging. Carter, do you have any experience with that? Having like smaller utilities go to outside help with their communication strategy and their messaging?
So we do have trade organizations that help with that quite a bit. So American
Mhm.
Public Power Association is definitely one of those that folks will turn to make sure that they've got a good communication strategy. But we also work with the ISACs quite a bit. So if we're not sure what's going on, that's our recommended mode of communication, is to talk with them first. They will keep that information as secured as you need it, and help you go through that plan or go through those stages. It doesn't really get to the question of notifying media or those types of things. Those are the things you really have to do on your own and figure out for your own utility what makes sense for the different scenarios you're walking through.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is more in general terms, and obviously, different cyber attacks, you have to look at it at a case by case basis. We do have a question from the audience. With the increase of cyber attacks on utilities during the pandemic, have your modes of communication changed? And if so, do you kind of expect these changes to remain in place after COVID?
We've certainly gotten a lot more use out of online systems, Zoom, Teams, all that good stuff. A lot of the meetings we used to have in person, which are tremendous, and you can't really replace that interaction with an online medium, but those things are sorely missed. But we have augmented as best we can with video feeds, stuff like that. As far as actually communications with attacks or anything else that are going on, that occurs a lot of times in an autonomous fashion. We'll get threat feeds coming in and be able to have our systems analyze those and bring those to our attention. That type of stuff has not changed. Just the frequency of it certainly has taken an uptick, and it's certainly taken a lot more energy to stay focused on these things.
I guess I would just add that utilities experience multiple attempts, more than multiple, exponential number of attempts on a daily basis. And most of those they're managing, and they're hearing from the EISAC and others about information and able to deal with it. Those are not things that the commissions, the state regulators, see on any regular basis. And so when we have periodic reporting and discussions with the utilities, they're informing us of the nature of these, but obviously in a non-classified way. So really, unless something reaches a customer affecting point, that is when the state regulators are going to be involved in the loop. So a lot of what Carter has said really is sort of the day-to-day management of things. But in the event of an email system being affected and not being able to communicate, there are alternate ways that utilities and state commissions have for communicating other than their internal systems.
Absolutely. And I'd want to touch on one of the things that Carter brought up was you can't exactly replace the face-to-face in-person meetings. And that's definitely sorely missed now as we're hosting this webinar. And I think, a key point of that too is going back to your slides was building the circles of trust and really establishing relationships with several different partners. So I'll ask one final question before we wrap up, and that is, does the regulator ever punish utilities that don't have a communications plan, or is the main benefit to having a communications plan, is that pretty much only in the self-interest of the utility to have that?
So I should have clarified this in my presentation. One of the concerns utilities had when we started our conversations was, would we be finding them for different things? Would this be an opportunity for enforcement and compliance. And we were very clear that no, this was not the reason why we were pursuing this. We wanted to make sure we understood and maintain that communication. There's no statutory requirement for utilities to have their preparation plans, their cyber plans, their communication plans. It is a question of best practices, however. So the one thing regulators do is we review requests for rate increases, right? We set the utilities rates, not the non-regulated utilities, but the regulated utilities. And so for expenses that they bring forward to us for putting into customer rates, we have to make sure that their actions are prudent. So that is where that might come into play, not fining or enforcement of some kind, but it would be in the nature of what is the prudent action that the utilities are taking. And oftentimes we don't see, and you've seen this in some of the other presentations, we don't see direct cybersecurity expenses put into a utilities rate request. It's hidden in other ways. It's not very clear. But no, we would not be penalizing a utility for not having a communications plan on cyber or a plan for cyber.
There's certainly a NERC SIP aspect to that question, which if you are in that space and you do have requirements that you have to meet, then you certainly have to have those plans in place, the incident response plans, the timeliness of communicating an event, understanding an event, detecting the event, stuff like that. So there's certainly aspects in there, and DOE has their own regulations around utilities and events that disrupt the electric grid and stuff like that. So I guess it depends on what side of the fence you're talking about as to the response and what the requirements are.
Great. And I actually lied. We got one final question from the audience, and that's how are attacks classified by frequency type, like DDoS attacks, ransomware, etc.?
That's going to be probably utility by utility. We take a lot of those individual events that come in, and we compare them against what we're seeing, the indicators of compromise, the IOCs. What's going on? Is that thing affecting us or not? Are we seeing that type of traffic or not? That tells us the criticality and how much energy and effort we're going to place into that particular thing. So I don't necessarily classify a denial of service attack differently than ransomware. It's an event if it affects us, and that's the way that we see them.
Mm-hmm. And any final thoughts or?
No, that's not really in our area of expertise. I guess I'd just follow up response. If a utility is fined by NERC for not complying with its SIP requirements, that's probably not something we would allow to be passed through to customers in rates. So I would just comment on that, but I don't have any comment on the question from the audience.
That's perfectly all right. And with that, I would just like to again thank you, Ann and Carter, for your insightful presentations. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for this webinar. This is our 15th one. Please be on the lookout for an invitation for our first industry panel on November 18th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. There is also a quick survey after the webinar, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. And if you have any comments, please feel free to write them in the survey. Again, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar on the website and the PowerPoint presentations on the website. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend, and stay safe, everyone. And thanks again, Ann and Carter, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.